Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome. Use the chat to tell us where you're tuning in from. I made sure it's turned on this time. So let us know where you are. Aran and I are in Seattle. Abra is in Ohio right now. Sterling Heights, Michigan, Seattle, Woodinville, hello. Oh, hi, Vivian. We'll see you on Monday. Katie Moss in Eugene, Oregon, hello. Lisa in Portland, hello. Oh, hi, Donna in Kirkland. Good to see you. Right, and we'll let a few more people get tuned in and then we'll get started. Clarissa in Costa Mesa, California. Thank you for joining us. Deb in Anchorage. Colleen in Chicago. Welcome, everyone. All right, let me just see how we're doing here. Logan, Utah. Hi, Ashley. All right, we will go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Laura Hamilton. I have a cookbook shop here in Seattle, Washington that's called Booklarder. And a big part of our business is that we do a lot of author talks. And we do a lot of them in person in the store, but we have continued to do a few of them virtually as well, so that authors like Abra who don't necessarily make it to the West Coast can join us. And also people from all over the country can join us as well. This talk is being recorded, and so it will be available on YouTube after in like the next 24 to 48 hours, just on the Booklarder YouTube channel. You can find all of our past virtual author talks there. There are, 3 years worth of them almost, and some really great conversations up there. So feel free to take a look at those. We are so delighted today to welcome Abra Berens. She is the author of PULP, the third in the ingredients trilogy, I guess. The follow-ons to Grist and Roughage. PULP is a book about sweet and savory uses of fruit. She is going to talk with Seattle-based author Aran Goyoaga. They're going to talk about the book. They are, of course, going to leave time for questions. So you can use that little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. Use that chat to talk to each other, and use the Q&A button to ask questions of Abra and Aran. You can support the author talk, of course, by purchasing a copy of PULP. Abra was nice enough to send us some book plates. And so you actually get a signed copy of the book when you order it from Booklarder. I'll drop a little link into the chat to make that easy for you. And thank you to everyone who has done that already. We've also got the closed captions turned on. If that's useful for you, you can control whether or not you see them, again, using that little captions button at the bottom of your screen. All right, so I am now going to turn things over to Aran Goyoaga and Abra Berens.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Abra. How are you? Oh, wait, am I muted? No, you're muted.
Now I've got it. Only 3 years into using Zoom and I figured out the mute section.
So good to see you and to meet you, because we've never met in person. I'm so excited for your book. I spent the last week kind of sitting with it and reading it and reading the introductions to each fruit chapter, all the interviews. There's so much to unpack. And I feel like there's, like I told you earlier, I feel like there's so many conversations to be had here. And I want to kind of divide the talk into sections, maybe one that deals a little bit more about agriculture and what you've learned from interviewing all the people in the book. And then also the recipes and fruit and all that stuff. But and I'm not going to ask you what your favorite fruit is, because if you read the book, you will see it's not Abra's favorite question. But I will. We will talk about it. Tell us where you are.
Well, I'm having a one night stay in Columbus, Ohio. I live in Michigan, but I'm in Ohio because there is a Great Lakes Independent Booksellers event. And so anytime a bookseller, someone like Lara, says, hey, can you come out and help us with this? I certainly want to, because obviously these independent stores are just the like backbone of the community for authors and readers, and it's just such a privilege to get to be here. But yeah, I was saying to Aaron earlier that like I don't normally have quite so much plaid around me, but I'm feeling very studily studly this today.
That's amazing. I also saw a couple of days ago, I was telling you that I actually, people probably don't know, but I'm actually from the Basque Country in Spain. But the first place I ever visited in the US was Sterling Heights, Michigan. I see there's someone joining from there.
I know, I saw that when everybody popped in, and I was like, it must be a long lost friend for you from Sterling Heights, because that's very specific.
No, I haven't stayed in touch with anybody. I was 13 years old, but I loved it. So anyway, so that was also part of why this book, even though it's not only about the Midwest, but it does have such a Midwestern heart, because that's where you're from, and that's where you work, and you're so tied to the land and to cooking, it was really kind of touching and endearing for me to read about it.
I'm so glad. I think the more that I do things like this or book events, and get to travel around, the more it feels like there's a lot of Midwest connections around the country and around the world. And I was just doing an event up in Traverse City, and I was talking with someone who had just been traveling in Italy. And I guess it was a restaurant owner that he was talking to. And they said, oh, where are you from? Traverse City, Michigan. He was like, I love Traverse City. We try to go every 5 years. And it's like, what? That's crazy. But yeah, it always seems like there's some sort of connection through, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, I thought that was so, I don't know. I just really connect with it. And I kind of want to know, I actually, before I was crafting my questions, I wanted to know, I read other interviews that you did and kind of learn a little bit more about your trajectory. And you've been kind of all over the place. I mean, not all over the place, very focused in food growing and cooking. But can you tell us, like, you grew up on a farm,
Yeah.
then you started a farm, you went to Ireland. Like, I don't know if I have the chronology all correct, but just tell
Yeah.
us a little bit about your connection.
Well, it's interesting that it strikes you that way, because is how I have felt periodically in my life, where I'm just like, where is all of this going? And I remember distinctly having a conversation with a mentor of mine. I was just like, I don't know, like I'm, doing everything from farming to cooking on the line in a restaurant to sometimes serving in a restaurant. The same restaurant needed help on a Saturday, so I went from the kitchen to the front of house, baking as much as I could, and then took some time as a butcher, like things like that. And I think what it is that I'm really a curious person. And something I realized just recently is I think I often feel a little scared of stuff, and I don't like that feeling. So I tend to kind of jump in and try to learn it. And what I've realized is that I went back, I found some old writings from, college time, which is really when my trajectory sort of changed into food. I grew up on a farm. But like every farm kid that I knew, as soon as you turned 16 and you could drive, you went into town and got a town job, because you didn't want to I didn't want to hoe pickles anymore. And so, I started in restaurants when I was 16, had different jobs there, and then went to college. And when I stayed at the University of Michigan, and when I stayed in Ann Arbor for the summer, I needed to get a job. And so I literally I tripped and fell into Zingerman's deli in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and then was like, oh yeah, I know this place. And everybody seemed like they were having a good time at work. And so I just put in an application, and it was like one of the luckiest things I've ever done, because that's really where my sort of path was shaped. And it was shaped in a couple of ways. One was that I really saw the power of small businesses. Zingerman's, for those of you who don't know it, it's a famous delicatessen and food import business. But it really has this like deep dedication to servant leadership and customer service and education. And the owner of Zingerman's like married my husband and I, and just all of these things that felt very real. So I felt like I suddenly had this idea of, instead of going into, I had gotten into the Peace Corps, I had dreams of working for the UN, things like that. And I thought, well, maybe I want to actually be a part of a small business. But I didn't know how I was going to do that. And then Roger Bowser, who's the chef and now managing partner at the deli, taught me how to cook. And then I was trying to decide, and I was talking to him about cooking school again, because I was kind of scared of it. And he said, I don't think you need 2.5 years of cooking school, but you should look at this place, Ballymaloe, which he knew because he had done his externship there. It's on a 100-acre working organic farm. It was a 12-week course. I didn't go into debt to do it. I got to travel some afterwards and work for amazing people like Sky Gingle and Joe Schneider. And then I moved back to Chicago, where my now husband is from, and worked at different places in Chicago. But I felt at Ballymaloe, the food world is so broad. I was trying to figure out how I would carve out a niche in it. And I decided that I had this, I guess with hindsight, I'm realizing that I recognized how rare it was to grow up around agriculture, at least in this country. And so I wanted my food to be a window into that work that is often kind of invisible. So I felt like I needed to learn a little bit more about vegetable farming. So I started a vegetable farm with my friend Jess and farmed for a while. And we did these dinners on the farm. And then everything's been kind of an extension from there.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, I feel like you did a lot of different things, but they're all sort of connected. And I think your books, this trilogy, really reflects all you've learned, which is from source to the table. And it seems so cliche now to say that, but I do feel like we're really disconnected oftentimes from the farmers. And when I was reading, I made a note of her name, and she's actually represents farm workers in Washington and California.
Rosalinda Gulian.
Yes. And when she was talking about, I'm kind of jumping in deep into the policy part, but when she was talking about her father, how he came to the US, to Texas when he was 10 years old, and became an expert at picking cherries. And I never thought about that. Like when she says, because when you pick a cherry at its prime ripeness, and I never thought, like we have these little tiny fruits and thousands, hundreds of thousands of them, and how you decide to pick it and that you're an expert. Yet that part of the pyramid of all the all the distribution, who grows it, who picks it, distributes it, who holds it in the warehouse, like all that stuff, it's usually probably the grower and the picker who get the smallest part of it, right? So I feel like we're so disconnected from that. And I love that in these interviews, you really go and sort of show us what it's on the mind of the people that are dedicated to agriculture.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think cherries are such a good stand-in for so many of the things we wanted to talk about in this book. And for those of you who haven't read all three, Roughage is very much about my time farming vegetables and sort of the context that I wanted to bring around how much work goes into bringing each individual crop to market, or just like another story about it. And then the second book is called Grist, and it's on grains and legumes, which really started in my mind because the farm where I work now, Grainer Farm, it really grew its grain program, grain and edible beans. And so I suddenly had this whole new crop of ingredients to work with that I was kind of fixated on. And then the fruit book, I had actually been thinking about maybe even before Roughage, but there was such a delay in putting it out because it took a lot of convincing a publisher, let alone my publisher at Chronicle, to put out a fruit book, because I guess historically fruit books don't sell that well. And so it's been interesting to kind of see how I'm really grateful now that we didn't start with the fruit book, because it is probably the most honed. And if Roughage was about my stories, in Grist, it was like, how are we going to talk about growing? I've never grown rice. I don't know what goes into that. So that's where the idea, I like woke up in the middle of the night and I was like, we can just ask them. And it was like, this like duh moment. And then I liked doing those interviews so much that Grist is really about scale and supply chain and where our ingredients came from historically. Because in Grist, there's 30 ingredients, I think, and only one of them is indigenous to the United States. So there's a long and complicated history with a lot of these ingredients and how they got to this country, sometimes forcibly, and kind of what that means. And it was written at the height of the pandemic. And so all of a sudden there's these things and called essentials, like beans and flour. Those are the things that are missing from the shelves. And there's all of these people who have been deemed essential workers that we don't really treat as though they're essential. And so those were kind of the two tacks that I wanted to take. And with the fruit book, I really wanted to dive into scale, farming scale, because I think it's something people don't think that much about and how it affects all parts of the business. And then also specifically the labor issues regarding fruit. And that's kind of a stand-in for all agricultural workers. But cherries are a great example of that, because there's sort of Abby Schilling, who I interview, who's a fresh fruit grower in Michigan, sort of sums it up and says there's kind of 3 different markets. There's the fresh fruit direct to consumer. So that's what she does. She grows fruit, she harvests it, and she sells it directly at a farmer's market or directly to a restaurant. And then there's a fresh fruit to a broker. And that's someone like Driscoll's, who grows all the raspberries you can want, sells them to a broker. They get distributed out along the supply chain to grocery stores, things like that. And then there's a third category, which is commodity fruit growing. And that's what most like cherry growers in our area are doing. So, a hand harvested cherry is very labor intensive, and it's a very small part of the market for which they get the highest dollar amount because someone's hand picking that. But then if you go to like the cherries that are harvested for cherry pie filling, those are harvested mechanically. So it's far fewer hands touching it. It is still skilled work, but you're not going through the trees multiple times. It's one big shake and you're done for that tree. So it affects kind of all the way along the path.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit different, but we have in Washington, we have that, I think, for apples, where it's, I think, the largest producer of apples that are sold as commodities, I think.
Yep, that's
If
true.
I'm not mistaken. Yeah. What is not to get too much into just like the policy part of it, but what is the thing that you think is the topic that is the most current? I think it's probably labor, I'm assuming, that you've learned about, and that is what has most potential for improving, and that it's kind of maybe the hands and mouths of sort of people that can make change.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the thing. John Oliver just did a piece to the last, he hosts the show Last Week Tonight, and he just did a whole segment last week on farm workers. And so it's a great summation of the situation for anybody who's interested. I think he posts them to YouTube or something, but and I think that the biggest opportunity for change, some of it is policy based, but almost all of those policy decisions are driven by consumer demand. It takes a while, but I think my hope is that people understand that they have a lot of power as a buyer, because, and I think about that with like, there's a whole section in the introduction about local versus seasonal and how we put those things together all the time. And so I kind of break that down in that they are actually 2 separate descriptors. And then none of that has any bearing on organic or sustainable or regenerative or whatever. And so I think that the best thing people can do is really decide how they feel about something. And then ideally, support with your dollars.
Yeah. I mean, that's with everything, right? That's where the money is where the power is. I also I think there's someone that is a loyal book larder attendant that likes to know what the table of contents and books are. And I wanted to talk about yours because I feel like there's so much. I really do feel like this book has so much to unpack. There's almost like a baking book in here that it's basics, like really pastry chef essentials.
Which I was anxious about you reading because I'm like such a fan of your baking. And I was like, oh no, I should have asked her to be a beta reader.
No, it's everything you need. It's breads, batter, crackers, crust, doughs, cakes, cookies, crunchy stuff and toppings, creamy stuff, curds, frozen stuff, meringue, pie filling, pudding, syrups, and pickle liquids. So that's like a whole book right there. That's part one. Then part two is the fruit, and you go through all the fruits. And I think not all the fruits, but you picked fruits that are available in your area. And I think for the most part,
that grow in our area. So there's no pineapple chapter, there's no citrus chapter, no banana chapter.
Yeah. Which it's very similar to our growing season here in the Northwest. And then you have the part which is sort of interlays in the book through the chapters with interviews that we talked about. And so I loved in the introduction in the book, you say fruit is I can never say this word. I always want to say it in Spanish so people know what I'm talking about, but I can't say it in English. Fruit is simultaneamente, simple and frustrating. I love that. And then I love how your friend Laura Pisker, is that how you say her name?
Pisker.
She screenshotted a tweet for you that said, some apples are delicious, some taste bad, sometimes blueberries are great, sometimes they are disgusting. You know what's the same every time? Doritos.
Yeah.
I was cracking up when I was reading that.
I know. And that it really summed up, for better, for worse, I'm kind of a talker. And so when I'm like kind of puzzling through something, I often am talking to people about it. And, I was asking people, like, I'm working on this fruit book. What would you want out of a fruit book? And, it was really split 50-50, that 50% of people said, ugh, I don't buy fruit because I never know what to do with it. And, sometimes it tastes bad or it goes bad before I get to it. And then the other half were like, I don't need a fruit cookbook because you just eat it. And so I was like, oh, there's somewhere in between here. And I thought that screenshot that Laura sent really summed that up. And it gets into sort of the nature of the difference between like a truly fresh, raw, scratch ingredient than something that's produced. And the grape chapter is kind of touches on the like flavor labs, or I think that's what they're called, mostly in New Jersey, that develop the like chemical compounds for something, and how vanilla and grape, most people associate those flavors with the like manufactured versions of them. I think maple syrup is similar. And I just remember thinking, oh, I know a lot about, how food tastes. And then I had really great table grapes and was just like, these are so good. Like my eyes like bugged out of my head. And I think that that's true for a lot of things, but then you never know for sure. So trying to write recipes for when the fruit is also like not at its most perfect.
Yeah, and there's also, it's not only sweet baking, there's also savory cooking with the fruit, which I also wanted to ask you, like, how do you decide, something that's already, for example, rhubarb, right? That it's a vegetable and it's already acidic and it kind of lends itself probably really well. Although we associate, I think, now that I say that, rhubarb seems to be more of a dessert thing that we do now. But so how do you kind of decide how were you thinking, or is it just intuitive to you because you've been cooking for so long to think, I'm going to create something savory with this or something sweet? Like, how do you work those recipes?
In this case, back to the table of contents aficionado, I mean, that is really how the book gets written. For me, at least, is that I, like a dutiful English student, I was taught to write an outline before you write the essay. And so the way that the process starts for me is that I sit and actually write an outline of the entire book. And then I can kind of see it almost like a map of the book. And so, and I like structure. Actually a pretty structured person, because I think within that structure, it frees up the ability to be creative and to improvise. And so I knew that there would be the baker's toolkit. I knew that, and in all the previous books, it is organized, and these books are organized all the same, where each chapter is an ingredient. And then for each ingredient, there's multiple preparation techniques. So if that's, raw, roasted, poached, whatever, grilled. Yeah, so that's a grilled version for the apricots. And then in all of the other books, there were all of these different variations. So this is how you grill asparagus, and then here's 4 different ways to modify the original recipe. And the idea was that we get so much asparagus for such a short period of time, but by the end of asparagus season, you're kind of like, ugh, what else can I do with asparagus? And then in grist, the ingredients are kind of pantry staples. They have seasons, but we don't treat them that way because they're shelf stable. And so without explicitly calling it out, there's a spring, summer, fall, and winter variation for each preparation technique. And in the fruit book, instead of doing all 4, there's just a savory recipe and a sweet recipe. And that kind of is a stand-in for the variations. So that was going to be the structure. So then I just literally sat on my couch and thought, okay, what would I want to make with raw rhubarb? And I made a bunch of ideas, and then eventually kind of whittled it down, and then tested, wrote those recipes, tested them, made somebody else test them, and then went from there.
Yeah. And how do you, when I was looking through this book, I studied with a French pastry chef a long time ago. And he actually does this every season when he starts doing a menu. All the fruit, well, I wouldn't say, I meant all the desserts. I wouldn't say all of them, but they're mostly revolving around fruit, used to. And then he would create a chart where it was, the rows were the fruit, and then he would have columns with contrast. So acidity, sweetness, contrast of texture. And it was very much like how you were talking, but specifically for the recipes. And he would fill in all the combinations that he could think. So let's say it's rhubarb. I don't know how you did it here with duck, or, with a salad that's raw, or he would put in all the things that he thought could, like a matrix. So when I was reading this, I kind of was seeing you doing something like that with your ideas.
That's so interesting, because that is part of what I was hoping to achieve with this, is that when I was learning how to cook, I really loved books like The Flavor Bible or Mind of a Chef or things like that. And I found that I wanted to teach people how to feel, how to internalize that. I'm really bad at memorization. But once I internalize why you do something some way, then it makes sense to me. And so I was trying to create that in these books, but with more support. So when I first fell in love with the Flavor Bible, I gave it to everybody as gifts for holiday presents. And it was if you were already a confident cook, it opened up people's minds and they were so excited about it. But if they weren't confident cooks, they really did not like that book. And it was really interesting to me. And so I wanted to try to create something similar, but a little bit more support than just here's a list of combinations.
Yeah.
And so the fact that, and I always sort of chalked that up to my restaurant time. So I feel very validated that that's a way that you were taught as well.
I mean, I do think it's a very restaurant mentality of here's what we have, and then combine it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about, it's going so fast. So many things I want to ask you. Okay, let's I know you don't like to talk about your favorite fruit, but
it was more just
Nice
a
to
joke.
that.
You know,
And the,
oh, sorry. Sometimes, so what Erin is referring to is that in the apricot chapter, I like acknowledge, there's always an essay at the start of each chapter. And so like sometimes you don't have a great or like meaningful thing to say. And so I try to then switch to funny. And I noticed something not only every book event that I've done, but other ones I've attended, there's always somebody that's like, well, what's your favorite, I'm sure someone's like, what's your favorite gluten-free pastry, and it's like, it's such a strange phenomenon. And then I realized that it happened not just with cookbooks. And I was I was literally at a book about penguins that was at like a zoo or something, and somebody in the audience was like, what's your favorite penguin? And it's like, what is with this? And so yeah, it's just a joke. Apricots are probably my favorite fruit. So that's why it's there.
yeah, and actually, I mean, I think they're my favorite warmer summer, or not summer, but yeah, early
Yeah,
summer fruit.
totally.
But then quince is kind of I
Yeah.
think because it's like such a, and I love that you have quince here.
Mm.
In the US is not, and you've mentioned that in the book, unless you know somebody that's growing it in a very,
Yeah.
either someone has a tree or it's a very small grower that just does like specialty fruit. You're really not going to find it in supermarkets. Although here in Seattle, there is a supermarket that I get it from, but
But
I
where you
think
grew up, there must have been quince everywhere,
oh
right?
yeah, yeah,
The like home of sheep's milk cheese and membrillo.
yeah. Membrillo is like, we ate it. Our snack when we were kids, when we get home from school, was a baguette sliced in half with cheese and membrillo. So I grew up with that, but here, yeah, it's not as common. And I feel like apricots, I mean, even though apricots you can find in the supermarket and they're very common and people know them, they're still kind of like a very, I think they're sort of like a sophisticated fruit. The same with quince. They're like apricots, like sometimes they can be too acidic, but that gives them like something that's like an edge. It's not easy, like you say, too. Blueberries are sort of like the
Golden
common,
retriever.
yeah, it's just like everybody likes blueberries, but like apricots are a little, if they're cooked or jam, but like they're raw. So I loved that that was your pick, because I have to agree.
I have to feel like there's, at least for us in Michigan, there's some sort of like Stockholm syndrome with apricots, because we we very rarely get them because they're the first fruit trees to flower, and inevitably they get frosted out, or they get, something happens and there's no apricots that year. And so when they do, like when we finally do have them, there's a good year, we're all just like so grateful to them for gracing us with their presence, but
yeah, it's kind of similar here too. And they're very short. I mean, I guess it depends.
it's a
Sometimes
short season.
at the
Yeah.
farmer's market we can get them, but sometimes here they're late, like almost like right before peaches. I mean, they're always right before peaches, but like even in like July.
Huh.
So I guess it depends what kind of spring and winter we have, but I feel like everybody will love this application of apricots.
Yeah, that was almost the cover for the book. It was one of the contenders, and it's interesting. It was always interesting to me that the book cover is also apricots, but it's a poached salmon with steamed choy, chili oil, and poached apricots. And yeah, so we went kind of back and forth because we wanted to talk about the baking in it. And so I thought it would be a baking dish on the cover, but I really love this image and the fact that it's the only cover that has an animal protein of the three.
And another one that's really interesting is this one.
I love that recipe. And, before the webinar, we were talking about one of the tacks I'm taking in my own life is trying to eat more plant-based or more vegan. And I really love that dish, because one of the things that's hard about plant-based cooking is it feels like there isn't like that stunner of a main course in the same way that like a roast chicken is always gonna like be everyone's favorite thing. And so that whole roasted cauliflower was something I had seen, I I can't remember where, somewhere in New York, it like, kind of made famous a whole roasted cauliflower. But I loved the flavor combination. That's with ground cherries, and ground cherries kind of burst and then let out their liquid. And so you can kind of spoon it over the top while it's cooking, and it makes this nice glaze. And then it has, the other thing I've been really into lately is Toom, which is the like eggless garlic emulsification, sort of like a mayo. And sometimes I've also been really into whipped tahini, and I use that a lot in place of in savory stuff, like in place of whipped cream, or just as something like a creamy element. And that's also really nice on it with some, and it has some cashews on that cauliflower.
Yeah. So now I'm super intrigued, like the whipped tahini.
Oh my gosh, it's the best thing.
You could do it with like even just like almost like it looks like a fool or something, like just like whipped tahini and some fruit, like poached fruit.
And my friend Emily Pfeiffer is where I learned it from. But it's just equal parts tahini, and I just use water, but you can use things like oat milk or whatever. So 1 to 1 generally, and then you just whisk it up, and it looks like it's going to break, and then it comes together into this like magically super stable, fluffy, creamy dip. And so yeah, we've been using it a lot on kind of in place of soft whipped cream. You could do it as a fool. Emily, who owns Botanica in Los Angeles, they do a dessert that's always on their menu that's just these beautiful medjool dates and then tahini and sea salt. And it's like one of my favorite.
Oh, that sounds amazing.
It's so good. Yeah.
I'm gonna try that. And then also now we go back to like pleasers.
Yeah. Well, and so that's the thing that's funny is that, Michigan is so known for cherries, and yet you rarely see a great cherry pie on a menu. And the pie recipe in the baker's toolkit, I worked for Paula Haney at Who's Your Mama Pie Company for a long time, and she had this really ingenious way of working with apples for apple pie, where how sometimes you make an apple pie and then the whole thing deflates because the apples cook. Well, after you peel and dice the apples, she tosses it with the spice mixture and the cornstarch and the sugar, and then it sits for 25 minutes, and then you drain it for 25 minutes, and then you thicken that liquid. So it sets the cornstarch and makes like a goo, and then you put the goo in the apple pie, and it will kind of soften again as the apples cook, but they've already lost some of that moisture, so they don't collapse. But then so that's how I treat dry fruit almost exclusively, but then a juicier fruit like cherries, I just thicken with some cornstarch and then bake it all together.
Yeah, so good. Oh my gosh. I mean, there's so many things, even just like focaccia, right? Like there's like not basic, because focaccia is not, I mean, it's a start, but what I'm saying is like there's so many recipes here that are just the kind of the pastry and baking kind of staples, and then you have all these ideas that you're introducing with like the cauliflower, and now you're telling us about the tahini. Like there's so much stuff in here. And let's see how much time. We don't have that much time. Let me see. I had another thing I learned that I didn't know is that rhubarb originated in China.
Yeah.
I was really surprised, and it came to Europe in the 14th century.
So rhubarb traveled from China mostly to the UK along the Silk Road, and then it was used almost exclusively medicinally in the UK. And then with the slave trade, enslaved labor made sugar much cheaper. And so suddenly you could use a lot more sugar with it. And that's when it became seen as a culinary thing, because it made, you could make something like desserts or fool or whatever with it. And so I think that gets into some of these larger issues. And I just think it's fascinating. This thing that I think of as sort of quintessentially English, like every English garden has a rhubarb plant, was something that was brought over and then used through sort of these global trade routes, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse.
Yeah. But also kind of made their own, because it's, it's been definitely used in other ways that wasn't only medicinal. But
Yeah.
I love how you have it here. This is such a beautiful photo just for the colors. Rhubarb salad, raw rhubarb salad, because most people probably don't even think about eating raw rhubarb. So
Yeah,
I love
and for me, the raw rhubarb and, similar raw asparagus was kind of akin to eating sushi for the first time. I was like, you can eat fish just raw and it's so good. And it's very bracing. And it has kind of a slightly like a surprisingly like kind of dry texture, almost like a celery. And I love it.
Mhm. And then also this combination, I was
Mm.
very surprised, but now I can't wait to make it, which is
It
lamb and strawberries.
hmm
That's
And
right.
this is an example of the kind of roasted or grilling, a fruit to concentrate the flavor. Because a lot of times, strawberries can be so great and so perfect and they don't need anything at all. But for us, if it's a wet and cold spring, strawberries, they're kind of watery and they're like a little bit flavorless. And so by concentrating the flavor, you can really get that like sweet and tart kind of combo that goes really well, especially with game meats or some of the
Mhm.
things like, lamb or duck or stuff like that.
Yeah, so many inspiring ideas. Okay, before we open it to questions, I wanted, I think this was the plum chapter where
Oh,
you
yeah.
mentioned your favorite poem by William Carlos Williams, um, that about the fruit that you bought with so much excitement and then you abandoned. And do you want to read it for us?
Yes. So this is again, I'm not a like I wish I read more poetry than I do, but I've always loved the William Carlos Williams poems or poem that says, "This is just to say." And it says, "This is just to say I've eaten the plums in the ice box that you were certainly saving for breakfast. Please forgive me. They were so beautiful, so good and so cold," or something like that. So perfect and so cold. And the part of the idea of this book is minimizing food waste. So I rewrote that poem about to make it about food waste. And the title is Just Saying instead of This Is Just to Say, because in the rhubarb chapter, I go off on a little rant about how the phrase just saying is like, I find to be one of the most annoying turns of phrases in the English language, because I find it to be completely without action. It's just like, oh, I'm just saying. And so that's kind of like a joke within a joke. But my rewrite of the poem is just saying, I've stewed the plums that were forgotten in the back of the icebox, and which you had good intention of saving for breakfast. No need to thank me. They were imperfect, yet not wasted. Fruit compote, such sweet kitchen gold.
Oh, so good.
Yeah, it was a fun. I was glad that almost got edited out, but they kept it in for me, which I was grateful for.
Yeah, it's almost I don't know. I know it's not the end of the book, but I love it as like wrapping up
Yeah.
your intention with it.
Mm.
Okay, let's open up 2 questions
Okay.
and I'll read them. Okay. Any from Laura. Laura, you're from Sterling Heights. Any plans in the future to maybe combine various aspects of your books and create seasonal menu planning?
Hmm.
Good one.
Yeah, that is a good idea. It's funny, we were just talking before the webinar, there's no other books currently in the works. And so I'm kind of figuring out what I want the next thing to be. And I might need to take just a little bit of time to regroup because like you've said, Erin, these books are dense and they have, kind of everything I've had to give is sort of in them. And so, yeah, I like the idea. I had, similar to how publishers had said, fruit books don't sell. I've heard recently them saying like menu books don't sell anymore. And so it would be interesting to try to figure out kind of like a choose your own adventure of different seasons and different menus and things like that. But yeah, so nothing in the works, but it's a really good idea and I'll hold on to it.
Yeah. All right. Katie says, I love the book and the previous 2. Beyond the Flavor Bible and Mind of a Chef, what are some of your favorite books on cooking? What books are you reading right now?
I mean, I'm really excited that Tamar Adler has a new book out, the Everlasting Meal Cookbook. I her the first An Everlasting Meal was a book I read when I was first starting in restaurant kitchens, and it really, I think, has like sort of immeasurable impact on my style of cooking. And so I've been kind of diving into her cookbook with it. I've also been reading lately Stephen Satterfield, who wrote, he's at Miller Union down in Atlanta. He wrote that book, Root to Leaf. That was also really like something I read a lot when I was kind of absorbing different books. And he's got a new book out that I just got, and I'm excited to read that. I mean, Aran, I've learned a ton from your books. I love them so much. You're like so skilled at things that I am not inherently skilled at. So I feel like I just like absorb information. And especially because, you know, you do such amazing stuff without wheat flour. And it's like, you know, as someone who, the dinner series that we host at Grainer, you know, I'm really committed to honoring people's dietary restrictions. And so anytime someone is gluten-free or avoiding dairy or something like that, it's a nice challenge. And I feel like we've come to really, your books are dog-eared and then we've made lots of specials out of them.
Thank you. I also wanted to ask you about, I actually went on the calendar at Grainer, and I was kind of checking. I did yesterday. I was like, oh, I wish I could like go to all of these.
Come anytime.
You're kind of opening up. You open them sort of like they're not open all at once, right? You open them like May 1st, June 1st.
Yeah,
however.
the first of the month, half of the tickets for 2 months away go on sale. And then the second half go on sale a month to the day before the event. And some events we open all the way up, like we are doing we do these things called book and supper clubs, which are where we create a menu based around a book. And so we're doing one with Anna Hazel, who has a tinned fish book coming out. That's in June. But most of the dinners they're called our Taste of Grainer dinners, and it's a different menu every weekend. We've never repeated a menu, and we write the menus. You know, I get dish ideas from the other cooks, take them, and all of those ideas are inspired or informed by what we're harvesting from the farm, what we have in our preserve section. So we do a lot of preserving at the farm, and then also things that we're bringing in, because we don't have animals so no meat, no dairy on the farm, but we do bring it in from elsewhere. And so they're fun events. You like arrive at the farm and you get a guided tour of the farm, and we sort of talk about the history and what we do and why we do it. And whoever is giving the tour kind of has a different, you know, slant on what they're talking about, which is always really nice. And the farm is different every time people come. You know, if you come in February, it's a very different farm, and we're harvesting very different things than in August. So it's neat to see that. And then you land in our greenhouse dining room. It's this giant glass greenhouse. It's actually a Dutch greenhouse. That is, you know, all glass, so you can really see outside, and it feels like you're eating outside, but there's thankfully you get some protection from the rain and the snow. And then it's 7 courses, a mixture of family style and plated. And we just kind of go through it, an arc of flavors, and wrap up with dessert. And that's what we do.
It sounds incredible.
They're fun. They're really fun.
Yeah. Hopefully we can make it out there.
I hope so. Well, you know, just send me an email.
All right, let's more questions.
Okay.
This one's an interesting one. My family has an heirloom rhubarb plant that came with my grandmother from Iowa, and I was so happy to see a chapter for rhubarb in your book. Were there any rhubarb recipes that you love that didn't make it into the book? This is always one of my favorite questions, is the editing part, like what gets edited out.
Yeah. You know, one of the things I do, I was actually just thinking about this today, and how there's a book, I forget now the title, but it's like Rose's Diner. It's in Paris. Do you know this place?
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't remember the exact
This is
title.
Maybe I think it's bakery.
Yeah, Rose Bakery.
Yeah.
And it's an English proprietors who live in Paris. And I used to work at a bakery where the owners are French, and they would go back to Paris periodically, and they would had dinner there or you know, breakfast there. And there's a recipe in that book where you take rhubarb and blueberries and some orange zest, I think, and just a little bit of sugar, toss it around, and then you bake it, but on a sheet tray. So it's not, I would have thought to put it in like a hotel pan, but you bake it on a sheet tray, and it's just the most like magical combo of flavors that really is more than the sum of its parts. And I
Like
love,
caramelized? Like it gets leathery or?
yeah, it's stewed, but it's not too juicy because a lot of the juice evaporates. So it sort of concentrates it, but you get the blueberry and then the orange with it. And I'm trying to remember, maybe there's something else in there too, like another fruit, but I think it's just those three. And it's so good. And we would make that and just put it on so many things like yogurt in the morning or different things like that. So
Mm.
that book is beautiful and full of lots of great ideas. But I do often make that with rhubarb. And I was realizing that it didn't make it into the book. And maybe it was because there was already a baked rhubarb. I can't remember exactly why, because sometimes a lot of these baking recipes are just taken from people that I've worked with over the years. And it was so fun to get to like put their recipes in and then call them out by name. It was like a high school yearbook of people that I've gotten to work with over the years.
Yeah. And I mean, I love that you do that because it's such a, I think it's such a testament of your work that you're so mindful of the people behind cooking, behind growing. Like it is really about a place, which for you is a Midwest, Michigan in particular, people. And then you're meeting people along the way, but it does have this very like story of where you're from and the people that are in your orbit, which is really beautiful. And I love that you mentioned so many names.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've just been so fortunate to work with such generous people. And I made a decision really early on in my cooking career that I would never work somewhere where recipes were secret. Because I don't believe in that with food. Like, nobody invented shortbread,
Mhm.
and actually the woman who owns the French bakery where I work, Sandra Hall, owns Floral Bakery in Chicago, and I learned so much there. And she worked at Tartine for a long time, and she makes a shortbread that's very similar to the Tartine shortbread. And somebody asked for the recipe once, and I was like, can we give them this and blah blah. And she was like, yeah, of course. And just that, like, I think that generosity comes through in the food, but it's also interesting because what she said is like, I didn't invent shortbread. I learned how to do this from Elizabeth Pruitt at Tartine, who I'm sure learned it from someone else, who learned it from someone else, and you each kind of change it and affect it. And then you pass it on. But also, people are going to make it once. They're going to realize it's a total pain in the ass and that they don't buy as good a butter as we buy, and they haven't made it 100 times. And so it's not going to be as good. So I'm actually not that worried about it. And I loved that way of presenting it because it was like generous and kind and humble and a little like, and you'll come back for it anyway.
But it's true. It's never the same when you make it,
It's
when you have a
true.
specific oven and
Yeah.
all of that. Okay. Vivian says, I had never heard of quince before this talk, so I'm curious what other fruits are popular outside of the US, but not as well known available in the US that you recommend that we explore in our cooking. Thank you. That's a very good question.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, and you maybe have more insight into this, Erin, than I do, having traveled more and more as a part of your life.
You know what fruit that we used to eat when I was growing up, which is around a little bit before apricots? Loquats. Loquats, is that how you say it in English?
I don't know.
They look like little tiny apricots,
Okay.
and they are kind of soft, and we just ate them raw. Like I've never seen anything baked with it. I think that they're also quite popular in Italy, and yeah, they just grew wild where I'm from. But I don't know, our in the Basque Country, the climate is very similar to like here. So I feel like it's very much the same as what you have in the book. And we didn't have any like exotic fruits.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
I mean, and there's a whole, and that's part of, the reason I included Midwestern fruits or fruits that grow in Michigan, at least, and not other ones is because I mean, the book is already 400 some odd pages. So like you got to cut it off at some point. But also, those aren't flavors that I wield particularly well. And I don't, so it's combination of like, I don't have very many ideas for lychee and I could come up with some, but like I'm going to be relying on the people who have lychee in their food cuisine and their culture. And so they should just write those books, because then that's more true to the authority on it than I am. And I think one of my favorite lines in the book, I don't know if you feel this way, but sometimes there's like a couple of lines periodically that are your favorite when you're writing it. But in the introduction, I was talking about why there's no pineapple in the book. And it's because, I mean, I don't know jackfruit about growing pineapple, and it was just like, jackfruit's another one. I don't cook with jackfruit that much. And so, yeah, wanting to kind of keep it, but just again, sort of a silly thing that is fun too.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually cooked, our neighbors here are vegan. And so we actually made a lot of jackfruit sort of barbecue, fake meat kind of thing. I hate to say fake meat, but sort of in making of the flavors of barbecue.
Yeah.
But again, I'm not an expert in any of those. So
And the texturally, it's so cool. And it's so fun to explore those things. Alicia Kennedy has a whole piece about being a traveler and not a tourist. And I think that that's very true. There's something about traveling and getting to experience and explore something without trying to have a like export, economy on it. And I also think that there's something about not trying to co-opt those things. And so, I feel pretty comfortable with saying this is not a flavor combination I wield. Doesn't mean I don't like it. Doesn't mean I'm not interested in it. It just means it's not for me to write about.
yeah, I share that.
Yeah.
And you write about the things that you understand well.
Thank you.
And Laura had another comment, but it's not a question. She says, love the combination with Mobi Vineyards. Is that how you say?
Mobby.
Mobby.
So yeah, then this is something that I know we're getting tight on time, but there's an interview with the brothers who are now managing Mobby Vineyards, which is they're celebrating their 50th anniversary this year. They're some of the oldest vines in Leelanau County. And Larry Mobby was the founder, and he decided to grow and produce exclusively sparkling wines. And so they're this like beautifully nationally recognized sparkling wines that are so great. And the reason I wanted to include them is because, we talk so much about terroir and, wine really encompassing a place. And I was up north at one point when there was a really early, very cold frost, and the grapes were still on the vines. And Pete, one of the two brothers, was in his orchards, or his vineyards rather, building fires throughout the vineyards not to warm the air, but to keep the air from settling. So, cold wants to settle and then the frost sets, but the heat wants to rise. And so it would disrupt that airflow and disallow the frost from being able to settle. And I was thinking, this is an agricultural product. This is a farmer who is, behind these bottles of wine at 3 a.m, just doing everything he can to protect that fruit and those vines. And, that's not something I had ever really thought about before. And I've had a lot of their wine and I never think about that. And, it's a privilege to get to know them and to hear their story and to hear how many touches you go through to make a glass of wine. And now they're going to come and do a celebratory dinner at Grainer in a couple weeks time. So it'll be a fun, sparkling dinner.
Amazing.
Very cool. Thank you so much, Aran and Abra. That was really just such a great conversation. And thank you everyone for your questions and for tuning in. The book again is Pulp. It's fabulous.
I don't have a copy.
That's okay. You have John Glenn behind you though, so I mean,
There he is. I've been trying to keep him blocked this whole time.
I will say, in 3 years of doing these, I think it is the first time John Glenn has attended.
I'll have to do it every time from here. But
yeah, thank you.
Well, and Lara, thank you for everything that you do at Book Larder. It's such a special store. It's such a special place for authors, and our books wouldn't go anywhere without dedicated people like you stocking them. So thank you for all you do.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you. I mean, it's a real pleasure to get to share this book with people and all your books with people, both of you. So yeah, so we're recording this. It will be online on our YouTube channel within the next probably 48 hours. Thank you so much, both of you. Abra, safe travels and
Thank
enjoy
you.
the book conference. It sounds really fun.
Will do.
Thank you everyone for tuning in.
Congratulations, Abra.
Soon.
Thank you. And Erin, thanks again for taking the time. I've been like so excited to talk with you and get to know you. So it's a dream come true.
My
It's really
pleasure.
fun. Thanks
Bye,
everyone.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.